Hi everyone, I'm Kilian. I've been developing sites for over 15 years, but now I'm creating a browser for developers called Polypane that makes creating responsive and accessible sites much faster and nicer. A lot has changed in the last 15 years, and today I'll tell you about the many new ways we as developers can respond to user preferences. This idea really got put on the map with responsive design, which lets us adapt our website to various screen sizes. The seminal article by Ethan Marcotte introduced us to responsive design. It is now over 11 years old. While I'm sure all of you here today have some idea of what responsive design is, I wanted to get a definition on screen anyway. So responsive design is the way a website adapts to different screen sizes by reflowing and repositioning content as the available space allows. We do this by using media queries and flexibly sized elements using relative, minimum, and maximum sizes. More recently, Flexbox, Grid, and CSS functions like clamp and min-max have allowed us to do this in even easier ways. But there was a time before all of this. Before responsive design, we did things a little differently. In 2008, I wrote an article on Naar Voren, a then well-known Dutch front-end website, on handheld style sheets, using the now deprecated handheld media type. Support back then for handheld style sheets, even though they were the only way to do this, was, as you expect, pretty terrible, with just a handful of browsers like Opera and Mobile Internet Explorer supporting like a little bit of CSS. But that's not why I'm telling you this. I ended my article with a glimmer of hope. Soon we'll be able to use media queries that would allow us to respond to device widths, heights, and I really wrote this, number of colors. Back then, Opera 9 and Safari already supported this new standard. Things have changed a fair bit since then. The mobile internet and media queries were here to stay. Well, we're over a decade in, and of course, support for media queries is terrific. We use them every day without even thinking whether or not they're supported. We also have a pretty solid shared understanding of how responsive design should be approached. I think responsive design should be mobile first. You should use media queries with widths and emps, and if you do use media queries, choose to use either min widths or max widths, but don't mix them to keep them manageable. You should set your font size, the base font size, in as 16 pixels. Browsers have always done this, but it took us devs a while to catch up. You should allow for user resizing so they can zoom in. And you should know that scrolling is fine because really there is no fault. So, as is tradition in web development, if we have something that works well and that everyone understands, then it's time to move on to something new that's maybe a little less well supported, combined with maybe a new term. So that's what I think responsive websites are. In web development, we usually reason about what a device can do, but we really want to be responsive to the user, their environment, and their preferences. So responsive websites actively adjust to user preferences using user preference media queries. The device is really just a proxy. So there are a few things I think websites should respond to: user preferences, the user's environment, their network conditions, and still device capabilities. Today, we'll go over each of these and see what's possible in each of these categories. Not everything will be equally well supported, but for each feature, I'll share in which evergreen browser it already works. First up, user preferences. There's a lot, but half of these don't have great support yet. We'll go over them anyway, starting with prefers color scheme, or as most of us call it, dark mode. Prefers color scheme indicates whether your user prefers to see a light or a dark version of your site. They might prefer a dark version because it's easier on their eyes, or a light version because it usually has increased contrast. Both of these can be beneficial to your visitor. Using the prefers color scheme media feature, we can check for both dark and light. There used to be a no preference option, but it got removed since it was essentially the same as light mode, and browsers never implemented it any other way. Most of you will have a website in light mode. Adding a dark mode from scratch can be a big project. So if you want to add dark mode, but don't have a lot of time, then you can use cheap dark mode. It works like this. We invert the entire page using the invert filter. This makes everything that's dark light and the other way around. Unfortunately, what this also does is invert the hue. So anything that's blue becomes orange, for example. That's not great. You can't have your brand color suddenly be different. So we rotate the hue by 180 degrees, which means we end up with the original hue. It won't measure colors perfectly, but it's usually close enough. At this point, images and videos will look pretty bad, so we need to fix that. And we can fix that by adding an invert and hue rotate filter again, basically negating the earlier one. At this point though, the background color hasn't changed along, so we add an explicit background color. This one's dark gray, but you can also add a little bit of color depending on what works best for your site. I do advise not using full black because it's usually too contrasting. Now, this isn't perfect and it's not as good as a fully custom dark theme, but it will get you something decent in a few lines of code. Here's what that would look like. On the left, the regular site, and on the right, the cheap dark mode one. That's not bad for a couple of lines of code. So users indicate they want to see less stuff happening on the screen with the prefers reduced motion media query. The reason they want to do this can be things like motion sickness, vestibular disorders that can cause nausea and dizziness, and the animations can be too distracting to them due to something like ADD, or just that they don't have time to wait for your nice animations. If a user has this turned on, it doesn't mean you can't show any motion, but you have to be mindful. Use motion only where it helps understanding, and prefer animations that fade rather than move. And for videos, make sure you don't autoplay them. Here's the two values. You either reduce motion or there's no preference. So the best way to approach this is to consider motion as an enhancement. Design your site without motion and only add in animations when the user has no preference. But if that's an option or the site is already built, you can use the prefers reduce motion reduce option to turn animations off. For example, with cheap reduce motion. Now, this is very crude. It will just turn all animations and transitions off, even the ones that would be beneficial. In the example, you can see some weird values like -1 milliseconds. That's to make sure that the animations still play, they just take 0 seconds. This way, any JavaScript APIs that depend on animation end will still be called. If you do this, make sure everything is still visible, for example, with transitions that go from transparent to opaque. And for video, turn off autoplaying. In JavaScript, you can use the window.matchMedia API to check if you should, for example, autoplay a video. The .matches property is a Boolean that tells you if this media query matches or not. So while the previous media queries are supported across browsers, the next few have no or very limited support. So here be dragons. Consider them a preview of upcoming media queries. With prefers reduced transparency, users can indicate they want to see text on solid backgrounds. They want this usually due to visual impairments, making it hard to read text on patterned backgrounds, but it can also help people with dyslexia or concentration problems. Unfortunately, there is no browser support yet. Like reduce motion, there's two options, and one support lens, consider again to make the reduce case the default, and only add your transparencies when the no preference media query matches. Almost as unsupported is prefers contrast. This indicates whether your user wants to show your site with less or more contrast. Visual impairments can make it difficult to pick up subtle differences in color, so people with that will prefer a higher contrast. On the other hand, people with light sensitivity issues might prefer a screen with less harsh contrasts. Note that wanting less transparency is not the same as more contrast. There are different media queries that solve different issues. So I just said almost is unsupported because the latest Safari technology preview actually supports prefers contrast with the more value, and that activates when a user turns on the increased contrast accessibility option in macOS. Inverted colors is an option that is also only supported on macOS. You'll notice it doesn't start with prefers. That's because the operating system, macOS, and the browser, Safari, have already inverted all the colors for you. You might think you need to use this media query to double invert images and videos, like we did for cheap dark mode. But Safari already does this for you. You can, however, still shift your entire site to make sure your brand colors are still followed. In general, I do think prefers color scheme and the dark mode in macOS are more or less the successor to this setting and media query. The values look like this. It's either none or inverted. On the Windows side, we have forced colors, which map to the Windows High Contrast mode. Windows High Contrast mode lets users specify and override all the colors on their OS. Usually, this is used to create high contrast black on white or white on black color schemes, but it can also be used for sepia or even wilder color schemes. Users can configure this as they want. So, high contrast mode is a bit of a misnomer. As this media feature also does not begin with prefers, your browser has already overwritten all the colors on your site and has made everything uniform with the rest of your operating system. In this case, the active keyword will tell you whether it's active or not. And in addition, if a white text on black background color scheme is chosen, prefers color scheme dark will match too. Because all the colors have already been overwritten by the browser, there's not really much for you to do, except make sure that things like SVG icons are still visible. And because you don't know which color scheme the user decided to use, you can't use your own colors for this. Instead, you can use these CSS color names like button text and button face. But what if your colors are important? For example, when you're showing color swatches for a product in a web shop. You can opt out of forced colors with the forced colors adjust none CSS property and value. Make sure to use that just for the elements where your chosen colors are important though, and not for entire pages or sections. Now, these last three options do not serve the same purpose. Firstly, forced colors overrides all your styling to something that your user wanted, often with significantly increased contrast. With prefers contrast, it's your job to increase the contrast, but the user would still like to see your design. Lastly, inverted colors has no such explicit goal, but it's mostly used to make screens less bright. The light level media query lets us respond literally to the user's environment. The operating system will tell browsers, once they support this, whether the environment is dark, normal, or bright, like when you're in broad daylight. There's three values for this media query. Dim is for a dark environment, normal is for an average one, and washed is for a bright environment. Operating systems already use light sensors to dim or brighten the screen. And on your site, you could use them to decrease the blues when it's dark or increase the text contrast when it's bright, so that text still remains readable on a screen, reflecting a lot of light. Not everyone is lucky enough to have fast or reliable internet or unlimited data plans. Browsers can send the save data on header, and web servers can then choose to send smaller images and videos and disable any form of preloading, server push, or polling. Doing this on a server, though, is often hard to do because you as a developer lack access to the server config, or the configuration requirements are just too complex. That's unfortunate because it can have a big impact on who gets to see and use your website. Coming up is the prefers reduced data media query. It's not available in browsers yet, but you can emulate it after changing some settings in Chrome and out of the box in Polypane. Though you can do less with it than the save data header, which would let you send an entirely different website from your server, this is much easier to use. You can prevent downloading fonts and background images, or choose to download smaller images. And in JavaScript, with the Match Media API, you can prevent preloading and polling. We don't have time to get into it, but check out the blog post I wrote about this at bit.ly/prefers-reduced-data. So even though prefers reduced data is not available yet, you can detect the save data header in JavaScript with the navigator.connection API and use that to prevent any preloading from happening. It's available in Chromium and behind a flag in Firefox. The API can also tell you if someone is on a slow connection with effective type. This doesn't just check the type of connection, but also the connection speed and how long it took to connect to the server, to give you an approximate connection type. Combine these to test for a preference to use less data or a connection that would benefit from less data being transferred. Even though the device is a proxy to the user and their preferences, we're also getting more information about the device and its capabilities. Two of these are screen inset and interaction media queries. With the advent of notched phones, Apple introduced a new viewport property called viewport fit cover. Without it, your site would be shown with these ugly bands on the left and right side of the screen to prevent it from being covered up by the notch. When you turn it on, your site goes from edge to edge, but the notch now sits over the content. Since you don't know how large the notch is and on which side it is, Apple came up with a different solution. Apple introduced a set of CSS environment variables that you can use in your CSS to make sure your content isn't obscured by a notch or overlaid UI. You can use them in a similar way to CSS variables. Android phones, of course, also got notches, so this feature is also available in Chrome for Android. Note that these environment variables don't provide any extra padding, so if you just use these, your content will be flush against the edge or the notch. So combine them with calc to have some default padding as well. Lastly, I want to point out the interaction media queries. These are supported across the board in all evergreen browsers. We have many different input devices nowadays compared to when the web got started. Mouses still exist, but we also have touch, styluses, external controllers like a Wii controller, and even things like hand detection with a Kinect or AR glasses. Things that are easy to do with a mouse can be harder with these other devices. Hovering might not be available, and precisely clicking something might be next to impossible. With these media queries, you can adapt to these input devices in clever ways. Consider touch devices as the most minimal device. It doesn't have hover, and your input device is your thumb, which makes it hard to point precisely at a small target. From there, devices with a stylus add precision but no hover. Wii controllers add hover but no precision. And lastly, a mouse or touchpad has hover and precise clicking. These media queries only check the primary input device, but a user might use multiple input devices on a single computer. So make sure your UI works well with all of them. You can check for all input devices with the any hover and any pointer media features. That's our roundup of the new and upcoming ways we can respond to users' preferences, the network, environment, and device capabilities. With these, we can optimize and personalize the experience that they have with your site by responding to their preferences, creating truly responsive websites. Throughout this presentation, I used Polypane, the browser for developers that I make. Please check it out at polypane.com to start a free trial to play around with these media queries in an easy and user-friendly way. I'm Kilian Valkhof, and you can find me at these places.